Hello and thank you for watching the Angry Rooster Creations channel. Today we're taking a look at another fountain pen ink. This here is Noodler's Bad Blue Heron. It is from their Warden series of what are supposed to be very highly resistant forgery proof inks. It's supposed to be some of their most permanent inks that they have in their lineup. Today I'm going to be using this ink in this Platinum Preppy. This is a Platinum Preppy that has an extra fine nib. The inks in this series are kind of well known for being a little finicky on paper. They're kind of known for being fairly feather prone. So the reason I've chosen particularly this pen is this is the pen I actually use this ink in to try to mitigate that, as it is a finer line and a drier writing pen, being as how when you put the ink down it tends to sort of grow on the page depending on what kind of paper you're using, just because it really wants to wick into that paper, and it does have that tendency to want to feather. Now I'll preface this, my main reason that I use my fountain pens is for art, so most of the inks that I look for are inks that are permanent and water resistant, light fast, so an archival quality inks, and that's why I tend to have pretty much mostly Noodler's inks, because they have some of the largest selections of inks that fall into that category. And on top of that, they're some of the most economically priced inks as far as quantity that you get for the price that you pay. And when you're doing art, depending on what style of art you're doing, you tend to kind of use a large quantity. Now, I've got several different papers I'm going to be testing on. They're not necessarily the papers that are usually used for journaling and things. I have two sort of controls that are my worst case scenario, which is this sheet of 20-pound copy paper and which is Pen Gear 20-pound copy paper from Walmart, literally the cheapest copy paper I could get. I have a Pen Gear composition notebook, also one of the not ideal surfaces to write on with a fountain pen. Then as far as the other papers, they're generally art papers that I use for drawing and things. I have Blick 50-pound white sulfite drawing paper. I've got 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. And I've got a 98-pound Canson multimedia paper. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to the writing tests. So this here is the 20-pound copy paper. I am going to be writing 2 lines on the paper. I'm going to do 1 line in cursive. I'm going to do 1 line that will not be in cursive, and then I'll do a 10-second smear test and then a scrub and smear. Alright, so here is the Bad Blue Heron on the copy paper. There are a few places where, honestly, for the most part, it doesn't look terrible. Now, it looks pretty, for being a Platinum Preppy and extra fine, the lines are larger than what you would get with most inks in this particular pen. Because the way this isn't, it's copy paper, it's really absorbent. It really wanted to wick in. Now you'll notice, like for instance on this P, I kind of forgot what I was trying to write, so I stopped for a minute before I actually finished the word, and as the ink sat there, it blotted really bad on that part of the paper. Other than that, actually I'm kind of surprised that it did not feather worse than it did, but once again, like I said, this is a very, very fine nib that it was written with, that is out of a pen that generally is a fairly dry writing pen. It also wicked into the paper very quickly, so I could not get it to smear. Now, if we look at the back for the ghosting itself and the bleed through is not terrible. There are spots like where I said on that 1P where I kind of paused for a minute with the nib on the paper that it whipped through and it bled. But compared to the Polar inks that I'd already tested, it's actually not as bad as the Polar inks. I'm actually honestly, personally kind of surprised about this, because this, generally speaking, has been one of the more temperamental inks that I've used. And it has generally been a pretty paper specific. But then again, I have also had this ink in other pens before, and it's been a little while since I've used it. So, you know, using it in this pen again, more recently here, it's maybe just that I haven't used it in a while. I actually expected it to perform worse than this, but so that's a good surprise. Now, the next test we're going to do is the composition notebook. So now here we are with the writing test in the Pen Gear composition notebook. Alright, so I'm just going to say, generally speaking, it's a little hard for me to get the notebook under the camera, so you have to bear with me here. I'm going to flip this over just real quick. It looks like, okay, there was no bleed through onto my scratch sheet here, so it didn't actually, so the bleed through doesn't seem to be as bad. But from what I can tell just from while I was writing, this did feather and get pretty woolly. I was trying to write smaller because this is a college ruled book here. Sorry, I have a hard time seeing it. I'm just trying to get around my camera stand here. It got really woolly. And that's some very broad lines for a extra fine preppy nib. It's doesn't necessarily have like any kind of creepy feathering going on, but it really grew on the page. Now on the back side, there's some pretty serious ghosting, but actually, except for the scrub there, it didn't actually really bleed through. There's a couple spots where it looks like it wanted to bleed through, but it actually didn't bleed terrible, but it's ghosting really hard. I mean, you can really see it shows through the page. And speaking of the scrub, I did get a little bit of a smear. I don't know if that's going to show up. I mean, it's barely there, but I did get a little tiny bit of a smear when I did the scrub test. So it might be usable. You might be able to do it, but it's definitely not the best ink. I mean, in general, this is one of the worst papers you can write on with a fountain pen, but this clearly is not the best ink to use in this application if you have to. Alright, next is going to be the Blick art paper. So our next test here is the Blick white sulfite drawing paper. It is a 50-pound paper. It's not necessarily the best paper for ink. I'll just go out and admit that straight away. And it's also seemingly a bit more absorbent than some of the other art papers. So with some of the other tests I've done on this paper, it seems to almost like it's probably closer to something like the copy paper than the other art papers that I've used, because it does kind of absorb the ink some. So without further ado, let's get into this one. Now, okay, this did actually perform quite well on this paper, at least with this particular pen. I have used this paper and this ink, sorry. I have used this paper and this ink in another pen. It was supposed to be an extra fine. It was actually this particular Genhouse 619/777 that had some issues. It is an extra fine, but it's not the same extra fine as a Platinum Preppy. And it, on this particular paper and that particular pen, it was more prone to blotting. Here in the Platinum Preppy, like I said, the reason I have this ink in this Platinum Preppy is it behaved a whole lot better. And it doesn't really appear to have really blotted or feathered at all. It actually seems that this particular ink in this particular pen with that nib performs better on the page than I was getting on this paper with the polar nibs. It did get a little bit of a smear in the scrub, just a little. This paper, like I said, is still a bit more absorbent. It does want to suck in the paper more. And on the back side, there's really, I mean, there's some ghosting where the scrub is. There's some ghosting, looks like right there where I kind of doubled back on the P, second P in preppy. There's a writing error on my part. But other than those spots, well, where I marked out an incorrect word there, it's not terrible. But once again, this is a 50-pound paper, so you shouldn't really expect to have bleed through on a paper this heavy. So all in all, it did pretty good on this paper. And now our next paper is going to be the Koh-i-Noor 50-pound sketch paper. And here is the 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. Alright, now here we are. This nib combo with this ink performs really well on this paper. I fully expected this. This paper, unlike the other papers, this particular Koh-i-Noor paper is not as absorbent. It doesn't really just soak up the ink. And as you can see, this is the first paper where we've actually got some smearing. This does still seem to be, it's a pretty fairly quick drying ink. It seems to be, at least. Because it does, like I said, it really aggressively wants to soak into the paper real fast. But as you can see, there's really no feather on this. There is a couple times, like in that end, that's just my poor handwriting. I know, you can just tell by looking, my handwriting is not great. Even my cursive writing, it looks better than my standard writing, but neither is great. So excuse my bad handwriting, but there's really no ill effects. Let's look on the back. Now you don't actually see any ghosting on this paper, and you don't actually see any bleed through, and I put that to the fact that this is not an extremely absorbent paper. Because even though this is a 50-pound paper rating wise, it is very thin for a 50-pound paper. In fact, in some ways it almost feels kind of like a parchment paper. And I will note, this actually did lay down cleaner than some of the other pens I've written with so far on this particular paper. But this paper is what's called a toothy paper. It has a texture to it, almost kind of a grainy hair-like texture. You can probably see sort of the mottled finish. That's not an actual mottled finish of the paper. That is shading in the light from the texture of this paper. So it's not the smoothest paper in general, but it does tend to handle ink pretty well. And as far as this ink with this paper, it's not a bad combo. And the our last paper is going to be the Canson mixed media paper. So this is going to be the test on the 98-pound Canson mixed media paper. Alright, now this is a fully expected this result. There is really no bleed, no blotting and no feathering with this ink on this paper. And I fully expected this. This is a mixed media paper. You can see it also does not soak up the ink extremely fast because I was able to get a smear, but even then the 10-second smear, and that isn't too terrible. Now, once again, this is a platinum preppy with an extra fine nib. This is a pretty dry writing nib and pen, so you shouldn't have expected too much of a smear anyways. But it performed great on this particular paper, and there's no bleed through or ghosting because this 98-pound mixed media paper is not only not very absorbent, it's almost the same thickness as most cardstocks. Now, I will also take the time as I'm showing this. This ink really does not shade whatsoever. It is pretty much consistent all the way through and all the writing. There might be one or two spots where it's slightly darker at the end, and if I was going to see shading, I was expecting to see it on this or the Koh-i-Noor paper, but it is pretty much the same hue of blue-black or dark navy blue throughout on all the writing examples. And I have a poor man's chromatography I'm going to show here in just a second, and I think that probably explains why. So here is my poor man's chromatography. Now, I'm calling this the poor man's chromatography because this was done on a piece of paper towel, which is absolutely not the best paper for this, but it's the paper that I had on hand, and so it's what I used. This was done in a mixture of 70% isopropyl alcohol that was mixed in with mostly water, maybe about a 30% mix. And as you can see, it did travel all the way up the paper. The original line was here. You can see a little bit of a darker line there. But for the most part, this is a pretty consistent hue of blue all the way up. There are some streaking, but there's no really chromatic bands until you get to the top where it was beginning to kind of stop wicking up the paper. And I have done other inks. So far I've shown the polar green that I did in a different video, which was much similar, and also an ink that didn't shade. The polar brown, which I did 2 of, that really didn't want to go up the paper much anyways, but did show some chromatic change. And I have some inks that I haven't got to yet that, using this method, actually do show a chromatic change. So, there it is for what it's worth. I don't know how much value that adds, or if anybody was looking for this. And like I said, if somebody were to repeat this example or this experiment with this ink, but in a more proper paper, they would probably get better results that might show more colors or things that mine did not. But for what it's worth, there it is. And now for the final test that I'm going to be doing now, I'm going to do a quick water resistance test. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to draw a grid on the paper. I'm going to wait 30 seconds. I'm going to drip some water on the paper with a pipette. I'm going to wait 10 seconds. Then I'm going to rub the water in to the paper and then take a paper towel and dab the water off and see if any ink lifts onto the paper towel or if any ink smears on the paper. So here we go. Now, as you probably did see, I don't know if that came up, there was some ink lifting. Now, for the most part, the ink that lifted was at the end of the lines, and I don't know if you can see where that bled. So where there were, it was a 30 seconds after writing, which is not the longest amount of time. Now, this is 20-pound copy paper. I think I may have failed to say that, but you can see where the where the ink line stopped, and there was a blot of ink on the paper. That ink that wasn't fully dry did move, and it got lifted onto the paper towel. However, most of the actual lines themselves in the center of the paper really didn't move, and the ink didn't lift at all. It's just really at the edges, at these dots here where my pen strokes either started or stopped, and there was more ink on the page. I think if I had let this sit longer than 30 seconds before doing the water, this ink probably would not have moved. All in all, it does seem to be a pretty water resistant ink. Like I said, this isn't necessarily the most exhaustive water testing method here. It's just kind of a quick water test, but even if you write down on, especially on a pretty absorbent paper, and you splash water, if the ink's not fully dry, it'll probably move some, but the majority of it's going to stay where you put it. So, there you go. And so, now with my my final thoughts here, it did seem to perform a little bit better, but like I said, than what I was expecting personally. But like I said, it's been a little while since I've had it in this pen. I had it, the last time I used this ink was in a different pen that was not as fine writing. It does, though, compared to other inks with this Platinum Preppy, and I kind of wish I had another Platinum Preppy that was inked up with something else to show you, the same nib writes much broader with this ink, because this ink does kind of grow on the page, with the exception of the Koh-i-Noor paper and the mixed media paper, which are far less absorbent than the other papers I used in this test. Now, I do know that most people who would be looking at an ink like this would be more interested in, you know, Rhodia, Tomoe River, Moleskine maybe, Clairefontaine. I don't really have those papers because I don't do a lot of journaling, since most of what I do is, like I said, it's drawing and art related. So I just use the papers that I have available to me, but also the kind of papers that are more in sort of my lane of how I use my pens. Now, in the last video I made of an ink test video, I failed to mention that I've got several inks that I keep putting them on these same pieces of paper. And I'm probably either going to use this Blick white sulfite paper, I might use the Koh-i-Noor paper. But after I get done testing the inks on this page, you can see the divided lines. I plan on taking these pages and taping them in a window on the south side of my house, in direct view, you know, with direct sun exposure for a full month. I'm probably going to take a ballpoint pen and write on here in a ballpoint pen, and I have a couple Pilot G2 gel pens I'm going to use, because I do expect those to fade from light exposure. Those will sort of be my controls, and this is going to be a standalone video when I do this. But then I'm going to take these papers down after a month, and I'm going to come back and do a writing sample with each ink that I did, and then compare to see as a sort of light fast torture test. Because generally, you know, putting something with ink in direct sunlight for a full month is not what you would do. It's not what most things that would be written on a piece of paper would be exposed to, especially things like artwork. You wouldn't stick it right on the outside window, or, you know, if it's an important document. But for the sake of testing the light fastness, to sort of torture test it, I do plan on doing that light exposure test later on. So I know this particular test that I've done so far might not be the most applicable for everybody that would use these style of inks, but I'm hoping maybe that light fastness test with the particular inks that I end up putting on this paper might be something that would be of value to other people. So without that, with all that having been said, if you've watched this long in the video, I thank you very much. If you were informed by this, if you thought that this was, you know, good information presented, I would very much appreciate a like. If there's anything that you thought I could have done better, or you think that, or, you know, any kind of criticisms or, you know, feedback that you want to give that you think could potentially make my videos better, I would very much appreciate that down in the comment section. Any feedback helps, both positive and negative. And if you like what you've seen, especially if you've seen any of my other videos and you like them too, I would really appreciate a subscription. It would really help me out. But with all that being said, thank you, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.